Chapter 1 The Boy Who Never Grew Up. This is the story of Peter Pan, a boy who never grew up but ran away to live in the Neverland when he was small. The Neverland is an island that children visit in their dreams and where anything can happen. To reach it, you have to be able to fly. Peter could fly. Sometimes when he felt lonely, he went back to the human world and listened at nursery windows to the bedtime stories mothers told their children. 3 children called Wendy, Michael, and John Darling lived with their parents near Kensington Gardens. This was one of Peter's favorite places. You can see a statue of him there. The children had an unusual nurse called Nana. She was a big Newfoundland dog who slept in a kennel in the nursery. If she had been on guard that night Peter came, this story would never have happened. Mrs. Darling was a happy woman who hugged and kissed her children often. Mr. Darling was more serious. He worried a lot and did not think it was a good idea to have a dog for a nursemaid. Mrs. Darling used to tell the children bedtime stories every night. Then she tucked them in and lit their night lights. As she tidied up the nursery, she would wonder what they're dreaming about. If Mrs. Darling could have seen their minds, she would have seen a picture map of the island of Neverland. It had a lagoon, a pirate ship, flamingos, and a coral reef. There was a forest with wild beasts, savages, and fairies. Mrs. Darling was puzzled because the children talked so much about a boy called Peter Pan. They said he lived with the fairies. Mr. Darling thought it must have been some silly tale Nana had told them. "It all comes from having a dog as a nurse," he grumbled. One day, Mrs. Darling found some leaves from under the nursery window. "Peter must have dropped them," said Wendy. "He's so untidy." "But it's 3 floors up." "How could he get here?" said Mrs. Darling. "You must have been dreaming." But Wendy had not been dreaming. The very next night, Mrs. Darling was sewing by the nursery fire and had almost fallen asleep. The window blew open and a boy dropped in on the floor. He was dressed all in leaves. A strange little light followed him, darting around the room like a living thing. It woke Mrs. Darling, who knew at once that the boy was Peter Pan. She cried out in alarm, and Nana sprang at the boy, who leaped back through the window. Nana closed it, just catching his shadow by the feet. Nana picked up the shadow and took it to her mistress, who rolled it up and put it in a drawer. The following Friday, Mr. and Mrs. Darling were invited to a party at a house a few doors away. Mr. Darling was very cross with Nana and decided she had to be chained up in the yard. Mrs. Darling was worried because Nana kept barking. "That's not her usual bark," she said. "She only barks like that when there's danger." "Nonsense," said Mr. Darling. "Hurry up or we'll be late for the party." As the front door closed, a bright light appeared in the nursery, darting into cupboards and drawers. When the light stayed still for a minute, you could see it was not a light at all, but a fairy called Tinker Bell. The next moment, Peter himself came through the window. "Come on, Tink, wherever you are," he said, "and show me where my shadow is." Tinker Bell told him it was in a drawer. She spoke in a golden tinkle like a chime of tiny bells. Peter pulled out his shadow and shut the drawer, forgetting that Tinker Bell was still inside. He tried to stick his shadow back on with water, then with soap, but nothing worked. He was in despair. When Wendy woke up, "What's the matter?" she asked. "My shadow won't stick on," Peter complained. "Give it to me," said Wendy. "I'll sew it on." Peter was thrilled to have his shadow back on, and Wendy was so pleased that she offered him a kiss. Peter had never heard of a kiss, but he thought it must be a present, so he held out his hand. Wendy gave him a thimble instead, and forever after that he called the kiss a thimble. In return for the thimble, Peter gave Wendy an acorn button from his coat. She put it on a chain around her neck. Later on, it would save her life. Peter told Wendy all about how he had to run away to live with the fairies in Kensington Gardens. Now he lived in Neverland with the Lost Boys. The Lost Boys were children who had fallen out of their prams when their nurses were not looking. Nobody claimed them, so they were sent to Neverland. Wendy asked about the fairies. Once a baby's laugh broke into 1,000 pieces, explained Peter. Each piece becomes a fairy, and now children don't believe in fairies so much. Every time a child says, "I don't believe in fairies," a fairy somewhere drops down dead. That reminded Peter of Tinkerbell, who was still shut up in the drawer. She zoomed out in a flurry and buzzed around the room. Wendy thought Tink was lovely, but Tinkerbell hated Wendy and was jealous of her. When Peter gave Wendy a thimble, Tinkerbell gave her hair a spiteful tug. Chapter 2. Follow me. By now, Michael and John were awake. Peter told them all about the gang of Lost Boys, of which he was the captain, and their fights with the pirates. "Are there any lost girls?" asked Wendy. "No," said Peter. "We haven't had any sisters or mothers to tell us stories and mend our clothes." "You poor boy!" exclaimed Wendy. "I know lots of stories, and I could mend your clothes." That was just what Peter wanted, to take Wendy and her brothers back to the Neverland with him. He promised to teach them how to fly. In the yard, Nana was barking like mad. She knew something was wrong. At last she broke her chain and galloped up to the house where the party was. She got Mr. and Mrs. Darling, and they all ran down the street as fast as they could. By now, Peter had blown magic dust all over the children and was showing them how to fly. "Just wriggle your shoulders and let go," he cried, swooping around the room. One by one, they took off from their beds and followed him. I flew, shouted Michael. "Look at me," called John, bumping against the ceiling. He was wearing his Sunday top hat and looked very funny. "Oh, lovely," cried Wendy in midair. Mr. and Mrs. Darling and Nana could see the nursery window lit up. Against the curtains they saw the shadows of 3 little figures circling around and around in the air. No, not 3, 4. They rushed upstairs and burst into the room, but they were too late. Peter said, "Follow me," and soared out into the night with John, Michael, and Wendy right behind him. Chapter 3. The Flight. Peter said that the way to the Neverland was easy. Second to the right and straight on till morning. But it seemed to take a very long time. At first it was fun. The children circled around church spires and raced each other among the clouds. But as they went on, they grew tired and hungry. Peter stole food for them from the beaks of passing birds, but it was not like a proper meal. At last they saw the Neverland below. It was just as they had imagined. They saw the lagoon, redskins' wigwams, and the wild beasts. As they flew down through the treetops, Peter told the children about the pirates and their dreadful leader, Captain Hook. The children had all heard of him. He was the most bloodthirsty buccaneer who had ever sailed to the Spanish Main. "I cut off his right hand," said Peter proudly. "Now he has an iron hook instead, and uses it like a claw." The children shivered. "One thing you must promise," Peter went on. "If you meet Captain Hook in the open fight, leave me to deal with him." The children promised. Just then, Tinkerbell flew up to warn them that the pirates had loaded the big gun, Big Tom. They could tell where Peter and his friends were by Tink's light, so the children hid in John's top hat, which Wendy carried. Suddenly there was an enormous bang! The gun had been fired. The blast blew them on their backs and scattered them, and Tinker Bell and Wendy were separated from the rest. This was Tink's great chance. She was still jealous of Wendy and wanted to get rid of her. So, with her golden tinkle, she led Wendy away in quite the wrong direction.